Men like you hid while real soldiers died. The words landed flat and cold against the polished wood of courtroom 4B, cutting through the stale air like a blade that had been sharpened too many times on pride instead of truth. And yet the old man didn't move. Not even a flinch in his shoulders. Not even a tightening of the jaw. Just a slow breath that seemed to carry decades with it as Walter Quinn sat in the defendant's chair, his back straight despite the years, his hands resting lightly on the worn handle of a wooden cane that looked older than most of the people in the room, the grain of it smoothed by time, and something more deliberate, something repeated, something remembered, while Judge Samuel Mercer leaned forward from the bench with the kind of authority that came easy when it had never been tested, his robe draping clean and sharp, his voice carrying the practiced weight of a man who had never had to raise it on a battlefield to be heard, and the gallery watched with quiet curiosity that leaned toward judgment. A room full of strangers ready to believe the version of the story that came wrapped in confidence and rank rather than silence and age, because silence, in a place like this, looked too much like guilt, and age looked too much like weakness, and Walter Quinn gave them both without explanation, his pale blue eyes fixed not on the judge, not on the attorneys, but on the flag standing in the corner of the room, its fabric still under the fluorescent lights, as if it had forgotten what wind felt like. And maybe that was the only thing in the room he trusted not to speak out of turn, while the court clerk shifted uncomfortably at her desk, sensing something she couldn't name, and the prosecutor, young and composed, glanced down at the thin file in front of her, pages that said very little about the man they were all so certain they understood, because there were no medals listed, no commendations printed in bold, no record that matched the quiet weight in the way he sat, just gaps, long stretches of absence that the system had labeled as nothing. And Judge Mercer tapped the bench once, a sharp sound that snapped the room back into his rhythm as he continued, pressing the point, pressing the man, calling him a coward in clearer terms now, dressing it in legal language but leaving no doubt about the meaning. And still Walter didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't even look up, just adjusted his grip slightly on the cane, his thumb brushing over a small, nearly invisible engraving near the top, two characters worn down by time but not erased, R6. And for a fraction of a second his eyes changed, not in anger, not in fear, but in distance, like he had stepped somewhere far beyond the courtroom walls without moving an inch. And then it was gone, replaced by the same calm that had unsettled the room from the beginning, the kind of calm that didn't belong to someone who had nothing to say, but to someone who had learned, a long time ago, that saying less carried more weight than anything shouted. And as the judge leaned back, confident in the silence he had forced, the room settled into a tension that felt unfinished, like a sentence that had been cut off before the final word, and no one there could quite explain why it suddenly felt like they were the ones being watched instead of the man on trial. The silence did not break. It shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the pressure in the air before a storm that no one had predicted, and Judge Samuel Mercer felt it even if he refused to acknowledge it, his fingers tapping once more against the polished edge of the bench as if sound alone could restore control, while across the room a few heads turned, not toward the judge but toward the old man who still had not lifted his gaze. And that was the part that unsettled them, not defiance, not resistance, but the absence of both, the kind of stillness that did not belong in a courtroom built on argument and reaction. And somewhere along the second row Ava Bennett leaned forward just slightly, her pen paused above a legal pad she had stopped writing on minutes ago, her eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in recognition of something she could not yet name. Because she had seen men lie before, she had seen them fold under pressure, she had seen anger, panic, even arrogance, but she had never seen this quiet that did not seek permission, this presence that did not respond to authority because it did not measure itself against it. And her gaze dropped almost unconsciously to the cane resting beneath Walter Quinn's hands, to the small worn marking near the top that caught the light for just a second as his thumb moved across it again. R-6, simple, unremarkable, and yet the way he touched it was not casual. It was precise, almost ceremonial, like a habit formed under conditions where details mattered more than words. And Ava felt a faint tightening in her chest as her mind began connecting threads she did not fully understand, while the prosecutor beside her cleared his throat and shuffled a page, eager to move forward, eager to return the room to something predictable, and Judge Mercer seized that moment, his voice rising again, sharper now, pressing for a response, demanding clarity, demanding that Walter Quinn explain himself in terms the court could accept, because silence, in his world, was something to be corrected, not respected. And yet when the old man finally moved, it was not to stand, not to argue, but to lift his eyes just enough to meet the judge's for the first time, and there was no challenge in them, no anger, just a depth that made the distance between them feel suddenly uneven, as if one of them was standing on ground the other could not see, and the room leaned in without realizing it, every small movement amplifying in the quiet, the hum of the overhead lights, the faint creak of a chair, the soft intake of breath from somewhere in the gallery. And then Walter spoke, not loudly, not with the projection expected in a courtroom, but low, measured, a voice that carried not because of volume, but because of weight. And though only the front rows heard it clearly, the effect rippled outward instantly, as if the meaning had traveled faster than the sound itself. And Ava Bennett felt her pulse quicken as the two characters on that cane settled into place in her mind with a clarity that made her grip tighten around her pen, because whatever R-6 meant, it was not small, it was not decorative, and it was not something that belonged in a courtroom argument. It belonged somewhere else entirely, somewhere older, somewhere that did not forget names. And as Judge Mercer opened his mouth to respond, he hesitated for the briefest fraction of a second, a pause so slight most would have missed it, but Ava did not, because in that moment the balance in the room had shifted again, and this time it did not feel like it was going to shift back. The judge recovered quickly, or at least he tried to, leaning forward again as if reclaiming the rhythm of the room was only a matter of speaking first, louder, firmer, but something in his voice had shifted, a faint edge of uncertainty threading through the authority he had worn so comfortably just minutes ago, and he masked it the only way he knew how, by doubling down. By calling for the record to reflect the defendant's vague and uncooperative statement, by framing the moment as confusion, rather than consequence, because to acknowledge anything else would mean admitting that he had stepped into something he did not fully understand, and that was not a position he was willing to occupy, not here, not in front of a room that had always deferred to him without question, and yet the room was no longer responding the same way. The energy had fractured, subtle but real, and Ava Bennett felt it more clearly than anyone, her instincts sharpening as she replayed the words in her mind. Not the tone, not the delivery, but the content, the structure of it, the way it had not been offered as explanation but as fact. Raven 6 survived, the rest did not, and that was not a defense, it was a statement of record, the kind that did not belong in a civilian file, because it had never been written down where civilians could read it, and her hand moved before she made a conscious decision. Sliding her phone from her bag beneath the desk, her posture unchanged, her face composed, while her thumb hovered over a contact she had not used in years, a number saved under a name that carried its own quiet weight. Her father, retired, but never entirely disconnected from the world he had spent 3 decades navigating, and she hesitated only for a second, not out of doubt, but out of respect for what she might be pulling into this room, because if she was right, if those two characters meant what she was beginning to suspect, then this was no longer just a hearing. It was something else entirely, something that had already moved beyond the authority of the bench without anyone announcing it. And when she finally pressed call, she turned slightly away, her voice low, controlled, careful not to draw attention, while at the front of the room, Judge Mercer continued, pressing for clarity, demanding that the defendant speak plainly, explain himself in terms the court could evaluate, and Walter Quinn did not resist, did not argue, did not shift in his seat. He simply listened, his eyes returning to that same fixed point near the flag, as if the conversation unfolding around him was happening at a distance he had already measured and accepted. And on the other end of the line, Ava heard the familiar click, followed by her father's voice, steady, calm, the kind of calm that came from a lifetime of hearing things that mattered, and she chose her words carefully, repeating the phrase exactly as she had heard it, not adding anything, not interpreting, just delivering it as it had been spoken, and for a moment there was nothing, no response, no acknowledgement, just silence, the kind of silence that did not signal confusion but recognition. And when her father finally spoke again, his voice had changed in a way she had not heard in years. Lower, tighter, stripped of casual tone, and he did not ask for clarification. He did not question context. He asked one thing, slow and deliberate, as if the answer would determine everything that followed. Did he say Raven 6 in open court? And Ava felt the weight of that question settle into her chest as she answered quietly, yes. And on the other end of the line there was a breath, not surprised, not shocked, but measured, like someone recalibrating the distance between past and present in real time. And when he spoke again, it was with a certainty that made Ava's grip tighten around the phone. Stay where you are. Do not let this move forward without verification. And as the call ended, she looked back toward the bench, toward the judge who was still speaking, still trying to anchor the moment to procedure, unaware that something far larger had already been set in motion. And for the first time since the hearing began, Ava Bennett understood that the quiet man at the center of the room was not on trial. He was the one holding the line. The courtroom clock ticked once, then again, each second louder than it had any right to be, as if time itself had leaned in to listen. And Judge Samuel Mercer felt the shift slipping further from his grasp. So he did what men in his position always did when control began to fracture. He asserted it harder, his voice rising, sharper now, calling for order, reminding the room that this was still his courtroom, that proceedings would continue under his authority, that vague statements and cryptic phrases would not be tolerated. And for a moment the structure held, the familiar cadence of law reassembling around him like a shield. But it was thinner now, brittle at the edges, because something unseen had already pressed through it, and Ava Bennett could feel that pressure building as she slid her phone back into her bag, her posture returning to neutral while her mind moved quickly ahead of the room, replaying her father's tone, the absence of questions, the immediate shift from curiosity to instruction, and she knew what that meant. It meant confirmation without documentation, recognition without paperwork, the kind of knowledge that lived in people, not files. And she glanced again at Walter Quinn, really looked this time, not as a defendant, not as an old man out of place, but as a fixed point, something that had not changed even as everything around it adjusted. And she noticed details she had missed before, the way his suit, though worn, was pressed with care, the way his shoes, though old, were clean, the way his hands, though aged, rested with a steadiness that spoke of discipline rather than decline, and most of all the way he did not track the movement of the room, did not react to the judge, did not seek acknowledgement, as if he had already measured the outcome of this moment long before he stepped inside. And that realization sent a quiet chill through her, because it meant this was not unfolding for him. It was unfolding for everyone else. And at the front of the room the bailiff shifted his stance, his gaze flicking between the judge and the defendant with a subtle uncertainty he would never have admitted aloud, while a murmur began to stir in the gallery, low and cautious, not yet conversation, but no longer silence. And Judge Mercer struck the gavel once, the sharp crack echoing off the walls, demanding quiet, demanding compliance. But the sound did not settle the room the way it had before. It only highlighted the tension that had taken root beneath it, and he leaned forward again, fixing Walter Quinn with a direct stare, asking him, plainly now, to clarify the statement he had made, to explain its meaning for the record, to provide context that could be evaluated and understood, because without that, he insisted, the court could not proceed. And for a moment it seemed as if the old man might remain silent again, as if he would let the question pass unanswered. But then he shifted slightly, not rising, not turning, just enough to draw a breath that carried weight. And when he spoke it was not louder, not clearer in volume, but clearer in intent, each word placed with precision, not offered as explanation, but as something closer to acknowledgement, something that did not ask for belief, only recognition. And though most in the room still did not understand, they felt it, that same subtle pressure tightening, the sense that whatever had been set in motion was no longer waiting for permission. And somewhere far beyond the courtroom walls, in an office where names were not spoken lightly, a line had already been crossed, and it was moving back toward them faster than anyone inside that room was prepared for. The air in the courtroom tightened further, not with noise but with expectation, a pressure that settled into every corner of the room, as if something unseen had stepped inside and taken position. and Judge Samuel Mercer felt it now in a way he could no longer ignore, a subtle resistance to his authority that did not come from defiance, but from something far more unsettling, indifference. Because the man before him was not resisting the court, he was simply not governed by it in the way everyone else was, and that realization, though he could not fully articulate it, began to erode the certainty he had relied on. So he pressed harder, demanding specifics, demanding clarity, asking again what Raven 6 meant, insisting that the court required explanation, that statements without context had no standing. But even as he spoke, the words felt thinner, less anchored, as if they were being said out of habit rather than control, and Walter Quinn finally shifted his gaze fully toward the bench, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a deliberate motion that drew the entire room with it. And for the first time his eyes held there, steady, unblinking, and when he spoke again his voice did not rise, it did not strain to reach the back of the room. It simply existed in a way that carried, low and measured, each word placed with care, as if it had been carried a long distance. Before arriving here, and he said, it was not a name we used in public, and that was all at first, a statement that did not answer the question the judge had asked, but somehow made the question feel smaller, less important, and a faint murmur rippled through the gallery, not of understanding but of recognition that something had just been revealed without being explained, and Walter's hand rested again on the cane, his thumb brushing once more over the worn engraving. And for a moment his eyes unfocused just slightly, not losing the room but stepping beyond it. And the memory came not as a full picture, but as fragments, the low hum of a radio channel held open too long, the static breaking just enough to carry a voice through distance and interference, a younger voice calling out, steady despite everything, calling a name that was not meant to be heard outside a narrow circle, Raven 6, and the reply that followed, calm, controlled, the kind of response that anchored others, even when nothing else held. And then the sound fading, not abruptly, not violently, but gradually, like a signal slipping beyond range, leaving only silence where voices had been. And when Walter's focus returned to the present, the courtroom felt smaller, the walls closer, as if the space itself had been measured against something far larger and found lacking. And Ava Bennett felt her breath catch as the pieces aligned further in her mind. Not as a complete picture, but as a shape, a pattern. She could now see even if she could not yet define its edges, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep, that whatever Raven 6 was, it was not a call sign used casually. It was not a label assigned lightly. It was something earned in a place where names were not recorded the same way, where recognition did not come with ceremony, but with survival. And at the bench Judge Mercer opened his mouth to respond again, to reassert, to redirect, but for a brief moment no words came, and in that pause the entire room felt the shift complete itself, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that could not be undone, as if the balance had moved past a point where authority alone could restore it, and somewhere beyond the courthouse walls. Engines had already started, decisions already made, and what had been a quiet proceeding was now waiting for something that was already on its way. The room did not recover from that moment. It adapted around it, quietly, almost reluctantly, as if each person inside was recalibrating without admitting it. And Judge Samuel Mercer felt that shift settle deeper beneath his authority, not enough to break it, but enough to make it uncertain, and uncertainty was something he had spent a career eliminating. So he moved again to restore structure, calling for a brief pause, a procedural adjustment, his voice firm but no longer sharp, and the gavel came down once more, not as a command this time, but as a signal, a need for time rather than control, and the bailiff stepped forward, announcing a short recess, his tone professional, but carrying a hesitation that had not been there before, and chairs shifted, quiet conversations began in low tones, the gallery releasing the tension in careful fragments, while Walter Quinn remained exactly where he was, hands still resting on the cane, posture unchanged, as if recess meant nothing to him, because the moment itself had never required movement. And Ava Bennett stood slowly, her eyes never leaving the old man as she stepped toward the side hallway, her mind already ahead, already connecting the response she had received with what was about to happen next. And she knew it would not be subtle, not at this level, not with a name like that spoken aloud. and outside the courtroom the air felt different, cooler, sharper, as if the building itself held less weight than the room she had just stepped out of, and she checked her phone, not for messages but for confirmation, and it came almost instantly, a number she did not recognize, no name, no identifier, just a call that rang once, then again, and when she answered the voice on the other end was direct, controlled, and carried none of the hesitation of someone asking questions. It was the tone of someone issuing them, asking for her location, confirming the courthouse, confirming the courtroom number, and when she answered there was no pause, only a quiet acknowledgement, and then a single sentence that settled everything into place. Remain available. Do not allow proceedings to conclude, and the line went dead without farewell, without explanation, because none was needed, and Ava lowered the phone slowly, the weight of that instruction clear, not as a request, but as a boundary that had just been drawn, and back inside the courtroom, Judge Mercer remained seated, reviewing notes that suddenly felt incomplete, his pen tapping lightly against the margin of the file, searching for footing in language that no longer seemed sufficient, while the prosecutor leaned in to confer with him, her voice low, suggesting they proceed carefully, suggesting they clarify the record. But even she could feel that the direction of the case had shifted beyond standard procedure, and at the far end of the room the doors remained closed. But something about them felt different now, not physically, but in the way people glanced toward them without realizing it, as if expecting them to open, as if waiting for something that had not been scheduled but was already on its way, and Walter Quinn sat at the center of it all, unmoved, unhurried, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged. And in that stillness there was no anticipation, no anxiety, only the quiet certainty of a man who had already lived through moments that did not need to be explained, only remembered. And as the seconds of the recess stretched longer than anyone expected, the silence returned, not empty this time, but filled with the understanding that whatever came next would not be controlled by the room it entered. The hallway outside the courtroom remained unusually still, the kind of stillness that did not belong in a public building during working hours. And when Ava Bennett stepped back toward the double doors, she noticed it immediately, the absence of casual movement, the absence of background noise, replaced by something quieter and far more deliberate. And as her hand touched the handle, she caught a glimpse through the narrow glass pane of figures positioning themselves just beyond view, not in a rush, not with urgency, but with precision. And when the doors finally opened, the shift inside the courtroom was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but absolute. As conversations cut off mid-sentence, and every head turned toward the entrance without being told, and Judge Samuel Mercer straightened instinctively, his posture tightening as if responding to a signal he had not consciously registered, and the bailiff took half a step forward before stopping, unsure whether to announce or observe, and then they entered. Not as a group seeking attention, but as a presence that carried it with them. Dark suits, measured strides, eyes that scanned without appearing to, and behind them, one figure who did not need to hurry because the room was already adjusting to him. Lieutenant General Daniel Cross, his uniform immaculate, the quiet weight of rank evident without display. And he did not pause at the threshold, did not wait for acknowledgement. He walked forward with a calm that belonged to someone who had already been briefed, already understood the situation in full, and as he moved down the aisle the gallery parted without instruction, chairs shifting, bodies leaning back, a path forming not out of protocol but instinct, and Ava felt her breath steady as confirmation replaced uncertainty, because this was not escalation, this was response, and it had arrived faster than she had expected. While at the bench, Judge Mercer rose halfway, caught between maintaining authority and recognizing it, his voice beginning to form a greeting that did not quite settle into words, and the general did not address him first, did not acknowledge the bench in the way the room expected. Instead, he continued forward until he reached the center, until he stood directly before Walter Quinn, and for a moment nothing happened, no words, no movement, just two men facing each other across a distance that was no longer defined by age or position. And then, with a precision that carried more weight than any speech, Lieutenant General Daniel Cross came to full attention and raised his hand in a formal salute, held steady, unwavering, offered not to the court, but to the man seated before him. And the effect was immediate and total. The courtroom did not react. It froze. Every motion halted, every sound cut off, as if the gesture had rewritten the rules of the space in a single instant. And Walter Quinn did not rush to respond, did not mirror the motion with haste. He simply looked at the general for a long, measured second, and then, slowly, deliberately, he returned the salute, not with the sharpness of ceremony, but with the quiet familiarity of someone who had done it in places where it meant something different, something deeper. And when his hand lowered, the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before it. Because now the room understood, not the details, not the history, but the hierarchy that had just been revealed. And at the bench Judge Mercer stood fully, the weight of his earlier words settling into a context he had not anticipated. And for the first time since the proceedings began, he did not speak immediately, because there were moments when authority had to wait, and this was one of them. The salute did not end the moment. It deepened it, settling over the courtroom like a weight that no one present had the authority to lift, and Lieutenant General Daniel Cross lowered his hand with the same measured control he had raised it, his posture remaining rigid for a fraction longer than necessary, not out of formality, but out of respect. And only then did he turn, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the rest of the room, his eyes moving across the bench, the attorneys, the gallery, not searching, not questioning, simply confirming what he already knew. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being heard without needing to demand it. And he said, "Permission to address the court, not as a request, but as a courtesy." And Judge Samuel Mercer, still standing, nodded almost immediately, the response coming faster than his thoughts could organize it. Because there are moments when protocol yields to recognition, and this was one of them. And the general stepped slightly to the side, positioning himself so that both the bench and Walter Quinn remained within his line of sight. And he continued, each word deliberate, each sentence placed with care. "The individual seated before you is known within certain circles by a designation that was never intended for public record." And a quiet shift moved through the room, not sound, but attention tightening. And he did not elaborate. Immediately, he allowed the weight of that statement to settle, allowed the absence of detail to speak first, and then he added, "That designation was assigned under conditions where names were not used, where identification was limited to those who needed to know, and where the absence of recognition was not an oversight, but a requirement." And Ava Bennett felt her pulse steady into a rhythm that matched the clarity of his words. Because this was not revelation, it was confirmation, and across the room the prosecutor lowered his gaze to the file in front of him, as if searching for something that could anchor what he was hearing to paper. But there was nothing there, nothing that matched the gravity of the moment unfolding. And the general continued, his tone unchanged. Raven 6 was the final call sign on a channel that remained active beyond its expected duration, and the voice associated with that designation maintained communication long enough to ensure the safe withdrawal of multiple units operating under compromised conditions. And he paused, not for effect, but because the sentence had reached its natural end. And in that pause the courtroom absorbed the implication, not in full detail, not with complete understanding, but enough to shift perception entirely. And when he spoke again, it was softer, not weaker, but more personal. There are events that do not enter official records, not because they did not happen, but because documenting them would place others at risk. And in those cases, recognition is carried by those who were there, not by those who read about it later. And his gaze returned briefly to Walter Quinn, not as a superior, not as an observer, but as someone acknowledging a shared understanding that did not require explanation. And then he faced the bench fully, his posture formal once more, and said, "The court may proceed as it sees fit, but it should do so with the understanding that the man you are addressing has already fulfilled obligations that extend beyond the scope of this proceeding." And the words did not challenge the authority of the court, they redefined its context. And when he finished, he stepped back, not withdrawing, but allowing the room to respond. And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was settled, heavy with the knowledge that something had been revealed that could not be undone. And at the bench Judge Samuel Mercer remained standing, his earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something more measured, as he looked not at the file, not at the general, but at Walter Quinn, And for the first time he saw not a defendant, not a case, but a man whose story had never needed the court to validate it. Judge Samuel Mercer did not sit down immediately, and that was the first sign that the moment had moved beyond anything he could manage with routine, because sitting would have meant returning to procedure, to distance, to the comfort of authority defined by elevation, and he was no longer certain that distance existed in the same way. So he remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the bench as if grounding himself in something solid, his gaze fixed on Walter Quinn with a focus that was no longer evaluative but reflective, as if he were recalibrating not just the case but his own place within it. And when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, not weakened, but stripped of the edge it had carried before, measured now, deliberate in a different way. And he said that the court would take a moment to reassess the proceedings, that clarity was required before any further action. And though the words were procedural, their meaning was not, because the room understood what had actually been said, that the direction had shifted, that the judgment he had begun forming no longer held. And the prosecutor gave a slight nod, relief and uncertainty mixing in equal measure, while the bailiff relaxed his stance just enough to release the tension he had been holding without realizing it. And in the gallery the quiet that followed was no longer uneasy, it was respectful, not demanded, not enforced, but chosen. And at the center of it all, Walter Quinn remained exactly as he had been, hands resting on the cane, posture steady, his expression unchanged, as if none of this required reaction because it had never been about him proving anything. And Lieutenant General Daniel Cross stood just to the side, no longer the focal point, but still present, his role complete not because he had spoken at length, but because he had said exactly what was needed and nothing more. And Ava Bennett watched the room settle into its new shape, the pieces falling into place not with noise but with understanding. And she realized then that the shift had not been dramatic, not explosive, it had been quiet, precise, inevitable, the kind of shift that happens when truth does not argue, it simply arrives. And Judge Mercer took a slow breath before continuing, stating that the remarks made earlier would be withdrawn from the record, that the court recognized the need for discretion in matters that extended beyond standard documentation, and though he did not apologize directly, the adjustment in his tone, the care in his wording, carried its own acknowledgement, and for a brief moment his eyes met Walter Quinn's again, not as judge and defendant, but as one man recognizing another. And in that exchange there was no need for further explanation, no need for validation, because respect, once understood, does not require instruction. And as the court moved to formally conclude the session, the usual sounds returned, papers shifting, chairs moving, voices low but present. Yet beneath it all the atmosphere remained changed, grounded in something that would not be recorded in the official transcript, but would remain with those who had witnessed it. And Walter Quinn rose slowly, not with effort but with intention, adjusting his grip on the cane as he turned toward the exit. And as he passed the general, there was no exchange of words, only a brief nod, subtle, almost imperceptible, and it was enough, because some acknowledgments are not meant to be heard, only understood. And as he reached the doorway, the light from the hallway fell across him for just a moment before he stepped through, leaving behind a room that would continue on, cases to hear, decisions to make, but carrying with it the quiet weight of a lesson that had not been taught, only revealed, that respect is not granted by position, and it does not fade with time. It is earned in places most people will never see, and remembered in ways they will never fully understand.